Hello, everyone. My name's Professor Michael Anderson, and I am the co-director with Professor Robin Ewing of the Create Centre, which is putting on this webinar this evening. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the Create Centre is on Aboriginal land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Aboriginal people are the longest continuing civilisation on Earth. And they are also the longest continuing storytellers on Earth. And it's from those stories that we continue to learn and continue to grow and continue to understand their culture and certainly understand our culture as well. So I just want to acknowledge that. Look, tonight is one of those wonderful things that happened. I was overseas doing something. And I just kind of bumped into somebody who knew about the work that the Royal Shakespeare Company has been doing, and they said to me, "Hey, you should get them on to do a webinar for Create." And I said, "Oh, would they? Do you think they'd do that?" And then I had the most wonderful experience of emailing both Matt and Lynsey, and them coming back almost immediately and with enthusiasm, saying, "We'd love to." I rarely get that enthusiasm in my life, and I'm so excited that I had it. For this work. This work, to me, and I've read a bit of it, is kind of groundbreaking and exciting in what it's trying to do. And it's certainly potentially a model that might be useful for other theatre companies and other organisations to think about. Obviously, it requires resources, and we can talk a bit about that. But one of the exciting things is that they've actually done it. The RSC's actually done it. And we have Lynsey, Dr. Lynsey McCulloch and Dr. Matt Collins here to tell us all about it. I'm not going to go into great long introductions. You can look them up on any number of places, particularly the RSC website, if you'd like to find out more about them. And I'm going to hand over them in just a second. Before I do, if you're new to Create and you'd like to join, we'd love you to join. It doesn't cost anything. You'll be told about the kinds of webinars that are coming up and the events. Anna's going to drop into the chat the information and the links to do that. Please join us. We are all about the application of arts and creativity in the world, and particularly in education, health and well-being. So if those things are of interest to you, please join us, and we'll keep you apprised of all the research, all of the activities, all of the conferences we've got coming up, and we'd love you to be part of that. Anyway, enough of the ads. Over to the main stars of the show this evening, to Matt and Lynsey, and welcome to the Create Centre.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Anna, for inviting us. We're really honoured. We're very happy to be here. It's morning, first thing in the UK. So stay with us. Okay, so we really want to talk you through a project that began for us in 2022. It's called Time to Act. Time to Act was a major research study. It was funded by the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. The Paul Hamlyn Foundation is a UK-based organisation. They're very interested in funding projects related to social mobility, to education, to young people and their prospects, and also very interested in teacher professional development, so a perfect funder for this project. And the project was designed to explore the difference that Shakespeare's work and RSC rehearsal-room teaching approaches make to the language development and the social and emotional development of young people. We think the findings contribute new insights into the impact that engagement with the arts and arts education can have on young lives. And as the project leads for Time to Act, we're really excited to share these findings with you.
So briefly, just to give a bit of background to the RSC, the Royal Shakespeare Company, we're a performing arts organisation, and we have 3 permanent theatres in Stratford: the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, the Swan Theatre and the Other Place, as well as residences in London, a presence digitally, and also touring around the UK and around the globe. The company's mission is stated as redefining how Shakespeare and great storytelling connects us, creates opportunities and brings joy. And the way the company does that is in 3 different ways. Firstly, it's through creativity. So that's our onstage work, which we undertake in collaboration with artists and creatives all over the world, as well as through the work of the world's greatest playwrights, past and present. And underpinning that is our house playwright Shakespeare, whose exploration of humanity we cite as our inspiration and our touchstone. Secondly, we do this through nurturing skills and talent of theatre makers. So within Stratford, we have costume, wigs, makeup departments. We're one of 2 theatres that has our own set building facilities, as well as commissioning music and lighting design, stage design and stage management teams. And the purpose of that is to nurture and develop those skills in the next generation of theatre makers. And finally, we do that through our creative learning and engagement programme, and that's the programme within which Lynsey and I sit. And that reaches over 500,000 young people and adults each year. And it really goes back to when Peter Hall founded the company back in 1961. And within the statutes of the Royal Charter of the company, it was established as a teaching theatre. The citation that you see on the slide there quotes our status as what we call an independent research organisation. So back in 2021, the organisation was granted what's called IRO status. And in the UK, this means that an organisation that is not a university can apply for essentially university funding, so research council funding. It gives it various application avenues, as well as a kind of platform from which it can then conduct its own research without necessarily having to rely on the academic sector. Most of these IROs are from what we call the GLAM sector, so that's galleries, libraries, archives and museums. And we are actually the first performing arts organisation to be granted this status. So it's an incredible opportunity for the company to think about what is it about the working of a performing arts organisation that can usefully kind of be used and thought about in a kind of research context. So how can the work that we do on stage be thought of in sort of these academic ways, and particularly thinking specifically around these questions of that creative learning and engagement. Upon being given IRO status, the RSC then undertook to conduct its first major research project, which is Time to Act, as Lynsey mentioned. Lynsey is from a Shakespeare background. I'm from a linguistics background. So both of our kind of skill sets are very different to the research project that emerged, but you'll be able to see the kind of relevance of those skills that we brought to the project as we go through the research design.
Okay, so as I mentioned, Time to Act was really looking at this combination of teaching Shakespeare using rehearsal room approaches. Sometimes we call them RSC teaching approaches. You can also think about it as a drama-based pedagogy. But just to be clear about what that means, what constitutes RSC teaching approaches, this is the definition that the company uses. So I'll just read this out. The RSC believes there are direct parallels between teaching and learning about Shakespeare in the classroom and the way that actors and directors work on a play in a rehearsal room. The process of rehearsing a play is active and collaborative. As a group, the actors and director make choices about the interpretation of plot, characters, themes, and language of the play. They explore the key themes and dilemmas that are present in the text. So students learning in this way explore texts in character, and you can see some images here of children in our rehearsal rooms. They inhabit roles from Shakespeare's works, and they embody that dramatic language from the text, as actors do. And I think, as this definition makes clear, they're encouraged to make interpretive choices and also to recognise that each young person's perspective will be different and very much their own. And I think at the company, we're more and more situating the student in rehearsal room learning, not only as an actor, but as a director. And we're just going to show you a very short, if it works, we're going to show you a very short video, which gives you a real kind of visceral sense of how we work with both teachers that we train in these methods and the children in the classroom.
I don't think it's an understatement to say it completely revolutionised how I taught and how I looked at how I work with children.
Working with teachers is an absolutely foundational part of the role that learning and national partnerships have at the RSC.
CPD work at this level really increases staff's confidence in handling complex texts and not worrying so much about the fact they're complex.
I think it has taken the fear out of teaching Shakespeare.
You're getting a range of professionals in a room, you're getting people that have worked across different areas in the arts, you're getting actors that have experience of performing Shakespeare.
I think it's relevant for all teachers. I think there's something in there for everyone.
There's a perception of Shakespeare that it's not for children like the children that I teach, rather who come from varying backgrounds, and it'll just make it more accessible and get them to realise that it is for them.
So they've got this perception that Shakespeare is for someone else and that Shakespeare is unattainable and I don't understand the language. But it is empowering and it gives them a sense of, oh, actually I can do that.
For them, Shakespeare isn't daunting unless we tell them it is.
I often hear teachers say, this reminds me of why I wanted to teach.
The RSC is very welcoming and supportive.
I mean, basically they just offer world-class, unique, amazing opportunities.
It's such an amazing programme and it's really special to be part of such a growing community.
Yeah, there's no other opportunity like it, really. The question really ought to be, why wouldn't you?
Definitely take the opportunity. It's been wonderful.
Thanks, Matt. So just to say off the back of that, you know, we do lots of workshops, with students who come to Stratford, or we send our practitioners across the country. But really central to our education work is training teachers in these approaches. It's not about parachuting into schools across England. It's really about empowering teachers to use these techniques in their own classrooms and adapt them for their particular classrooms. But yeah, I hope that's useful in terms of visualising what we do. In terms of the research, so the evaluation of this programme, this is our research design. So Time to Act had two main elements, a randomised control trial and a teacher researcher network. For the randomised control trial for the RCT, we worked with schools and teachers in England that were completely new to the company. They'd never worked with us before at all. But for the teacher researcher network, we collaborated with partner schools of the RSC and teachers who are very experienced in using these techniques. So it was really a design that allowed us to test this programme of work from scratch, from the training of teachers new to it, to seeing how it worked in an embedded context with teachers who worked in this way with their pupils for a long time. So we thought that kind of covered a lot of bases. So we'll start by talking you through the randomised control trial. And I think we can go on to the next slide, actually. Thank you, Matt. For the RCT, we recruited 45 primary schools across England, none of which had previously worked with the RSC or used these approaches in the classroom. These were state-funded schools. And another really important aspect is that they had average or above average pupil eligibility for free school meals. So these were in areas of structural disadvantage, and we use various different measures to identify those schools. And it very much matches up with the work that we do in our long-term partnership programme with schools, where we only work in areas of structural disadvantage in England. So the project focused on Year 5 classes, which in the UK is pupils aged 9 to 10 years old. And these classes were randomised into two groups, as is the way with a randomised control trial. So we had an intervention group who would receive the programme of training, and we had a control group. So our intervention teachers were trained in RSC teaching approaches. They had 5 days of CPD, continuous professional development training in Stratford-upon-Avon. And they delivered our intervention for us. So they delivered 20 hours of Shakespeare teaching using these techniques to their classes over spring and summer terms in 2023. Our control group, our control teachers, our comparison group, they did nothing. There was no placebo. They simply delivered their existing curriculum across that academic year. And both groups were then subject to testing before and after the intervention. So we had the best shot of seeing if there was impact over time and impact in comparison to that baseline comparison group.
So one of the challenges that we faced as the first performing arts pyro was thinking about how do we go about measuring the impact of the arts. It's difficult. How do we capture impact? How do we capture change? And how might we do that with greater specificity and greater clarity? So in terms of our approach, it was mixed, and that's Mixed methods in the traditional definition that we collected both quantitative and qualitative evidence, but also mixed in the sense that it was comprised of both validated tools and innovated tools. And one of the things that we've committed to as an IRO and thinking about arts research is thinking about the arts as a crucible for developing new research measures that do think about the impact not just of arts interventions, but beyond that in terms of indirect benefits that these different approaches might have. Today, we're just going to talk about 3 of the measurements that we used that we applied to the RCT. And those 3 are a writing measure, a teacher reflective journal, and the myself as a learner scale, which some of you might have come across previously. So first off, the writing measure. So one of the things that we hear about from teachers who've been using these techniques over the sort of 20 years of our sort of schools network program and even before that is the impact of active approaches and rehearsal room approaches to pupils' written outcomes. So we therefore developed a writing exercise to specify and measure what those impacts are. At the end of the intervention in July 2023, pupils in both the intervention and the control groups were given a short passage, and this summarises in present-day English the storm that the sailors encounter at the opening scene of The Tempest. So you can see on the right-hand side there, that's a screenshot of the kind of writing exercise, the prompt and the exercise that pupils were given. Pupils were then asked to write a message in a bottle as the shipwrecked Prince Ferdinand. And within that, they were told they could narrate the storm, they could describe the island, or include Ferdinand's predictions as to what will happen next. On the left-hand side there, as you can see, we had almost 1,000 responses, so a really healthy corpus of around 130,000 words for us to analyse. And that corpus provides the basis of the analysis that we'll go into just now. And we decided to think about this from 3 different areas of kind of language, if you like. And when we pre-registered the trial, so in the UK, one of the things we do in terms of making sure that we essentially you don't kind of retrofit the results and that it's a transparent research process is you go through a process of pre-registration with randomized control trials where you stipulate the measures that you are going to judge the success of the intervention by. And so what we declared was we were going to analyse pupils' writing according to 3 areas. The words that make up the text or the lexis, the grammatical construction of the text or the syntax, and the content of that text, which we would do through semantic analysis. So lexis, syntax, and semantics. And to do that, we use 3 validated tools which assess writing in terms of its breadth, in terms of complexity, and its sophistication. Encouragingly, in 98% of those software indicators, we saw that intervention pupils outperformed those in the control group, and we'll dig into what some of those were. And most importantly, from a research perspective, was that the results returned a statistically significant result. So we can confidently state the differences between the intervention and the control groups are not down to pure chance. So the first writing measure, lexis, so the vocabulary. Against an inventory of 27 indicators, intervention pupils' writing scored higher in 26. The one that failed was, not failed, sorry, the one that scored lower was actually adverbs. And interestingly enough, Shakespeare doesn't tend to use many sort of single adverbs. He's much more fond of a sort of adverbial phrase. They're quite convenient places to put figurative language and metaphor. So interestingly enough, that the input text might be prescribing some of the grammatical constructions and word choices of pupils, but that's for a future research project. Let's just have a look at some of the detail of that then. So the first thing to note is the overall discourse length. So pupils in the intervention group were writing longer pieces, and anecdotal feedback from teachers suggests that pupils really enjoyed the exercise in the intervention group, with even reluctant writers forgoing their break time to continue writing and finish their message in a bottle. Secondly, you can see in terms of diversity, that writing drew on greater overall range of vocabulary, and pupils were also more likely to vary their vocabulary within their writing. So we've got measures of diversity and density that score higher in that group. And in drawing on that wider vocabulary, pupils also demonstrated a greater use of sophisticated words. So in everyday communication, we tend to use a fairly limited set of words. And based on that fact, linguists have determined that a sophisticated word is any that falls outside of the 2,000 most frequent in English. So in writing, we saw intervention pupils using more sophisticated or rarer vocabulary. And then drilling down into those parts of speech, interestingly enough, we kind of got kind of lucrative potential in terms of further analysis with regards to this. Verb sophistication was one of the things that scored sort of highest. You can see a sort of 24% difference between the two groups there. And again, further research to unpick whether there's something to do with the active nature of these approaches that might be promoting that kind of more active use of and adoption of language within the written pieces. So then stepping up a linguistic level to look at syntax, in all 15 indicators of the software measures, writing from pupils that undertook the intervention outperformed the control pupils' writing. We saw the intervention pupils writing longer sentences. Now, why is this important? Well, this mean length of sentence measure might first seem a kind of crude indicator because you're simply counting the number of words in a sentence and then averaging them out. So it might seem quite crude, but it's in fact a measure that's been used in linguistic research for quite some time, and it's proved quite a robust proxy for measuring an individual's overall language ability. And those longer uses of stretch extend to the component parts of the sentence. So we see intervention pupils using longer phrases and clauses, and these larger units indicate a sort of greater syntactical sophistication, which is borne out by the kind of depth of syntax. So you can see kind of in terms of those dependent clauses, how pupils link between the different parts and structure those sentences. So they use around 20% more complex and dependent subordinating structures. And beyond the greater linguistic sophistication that entails, there's also a body of research into the increased cognitive load required in reading and writing subordinate clauses. And then finally, you can see there's a thing in there called the complex T unit ratio, 18.9%. We've included that here because that's designed to capture grammatical complexity in one score. So it's a kind of composite score, if you like. And here, encouragingly, it shows one of the largest differences between those two groups when it comes to those syntactical indices. Now, we were really pleased with the results that we quantified here, but beyond the mechanics of writing, beyond vocabulary and grammar, we also wanted some way to look at what pupils were saying, so the content of that writing. And we did that through semantic analysis.
Thanks, Matt. So to undertake that semantic analysis, we use what are called semantic fields. So you don't need to be a linguist here. A semantic field is a set of words grouped by meaning, essentially. So we used an established framework for undertaking automatic semantic analysis of text. And so this tells us what semantic fields children are using for this exercise and where those two groups, the intervention and the control group, differ. And, the good news for us when we crunched this was that the two corpora of writing, intervention and control, were distinct with respect to the majority of semantic fields. So we'd asked the children to write in role as Ferdinand. They were shipwrecked on the island at the beginning of the tempest. We asked them to write that message in a bottle back home, an SOS, a call for help. And they use completely different types of language to undertake the exact same exercise, which is quite an achievement, really, given the kind of narrow limitations of the task. So what you can see here on this image are the semantic fields used most often by pupils in both groups. So in red, we see the fields used most regularly by the intervention group, so those exposed to that 20 hours of Shakespeare teaching in this way. And in gold below, you see the fields used most often by the control pupils who had none of that activity. They simply read that passage that Matt showed you, that modern English passage from The Tempest. So the percentages you can see here are comparative. So for example, you can see that our intervention group used 42.5% more language related to government and public than control. And equally, you can see that control students used, if you go down to the bottom, 34.9% more language related to food and farming than intervention. So how do we account for these really profound differences? In the writing exercise, we set all the pupils. They were encouraged to describe Ferdinand's surroundings on this island. And actually, you might think, looking at this data, that control, the comparison group, do a better job. They use lots of language relating to food and farming, life and living things. But when you look at the samples in more detail, when you do that closer analysis, what it reveals is that in the absence of those world building activities that are so key to the rehearsal room approaches to teaching, the control pupils had to rely on those desert island cliches to conjure their settings. So we spent a lot of time reading a lot of work about palm trees and coconuts and monkeys and parrots. They were all quite similar, and they all were quite dependent on what we would all imagine when we think of a desert island. But the pupils in the intervention group, they created much richer, more expansive environments. They were incorporating descriptions of sky, sea, weather, kind of more kind of holistic environmental description in their writing. You could also say that their writing was less generic, it was more individualized, less repetitive, and more imaginative. I'd probably say as well, it's noteworthy that intervention pupils used 27.4% more language related to emotion. So that was something we were quite interested in terms of this year group and their response to this work. So if we just look at that in more detail. So here we're looking at the two of the subfields for the semantic field of emotion, because each semantic field has many, many subfields to sort of really drill down into the language use. So in these two subfields, we can see even more pronounced differences between the intervention and the control groups. So you can see here that the intervention students used almost 50% more language related to liking and 42.9% more language related to that spectrum of happiness and sadness. And again, this is interesting data, but you have to look at the writing itself. When we did do that, we could see that the pupils in intervention schools were more comfortable writing in role as the character of Ferdinand, much more comfortable expressing different characters' emotions. In this opening to The Tempest, you might know Ferdinand thinks he's lost his father, thinks that his father is drowned. So there's quite an emotional heft to this section. Students in the intervention group also used more language relating to speech acts, so to depict other characters, suggesting, we think, a greater level of empathy for and understanding of character from the experience of embodying those roles to some extent. We also saw that pupils in intervention schools demonstrated a kind of greater resilience and optimism in their creative writing. So, a lot of the control school students focused on the immediate danger of Ferdinand's situation. He was alone on a desert island. When he wrote his message in a bottle, it was, big, bold SOSs, come and help me, I'm going to die if you don't come and get me in the next 24 hours. And intervention pupils were quite different. They started to think about how they might alleviate their situation, where the food source was, where a source of fire, where the wood was to make a fire. So they were much better at sequencing their narratives. They could recall the past, and that was a sadness for them, but they were planning more positively for the future. And finally, pupils in the intervention schools showed greater inferencing skills. They seemed to comprehend the prompt text, that the modern English summary of The Tempest much better, and they showed incredibly imaginative renderings of what might come next. They didn't know the play, they didn't know what happened next, but they were better at imagining it. So what we'd suggest this indicates, we think that it aligns with the experiential nature of RSC teaching approaches, in which, as I've said, students are asked to inhabit characters and embody emotional states. And they also support exactly what teachers have reported seeing in their classrooms. And if we triangulate data from our linguistic analysis, from our close examination of pupil writing and the teacher's report, it does tell us, we think, that the combination of Shakespeare text and RSC teaching approaches has an impact on both literacy and emotional literacy. So in addition to conducting the intervention, we also asked our intervention group teachers to complete a reflective journal. So this had a couple of purposes, really. It acted as a fidelity test for our quantitative data, and teacher reporting strongly corroborated our linguistic and our academic self-concept findings. And I'd also say that in those journals, teachers emphasised certain things which were interesting to us. They certainly emphasised that in terms of broader classroom behaviour and involvement in schoolwork, pupils demonstrated increased engagement, increased trust in both each other and their teacher, and increased confidence. Teachers spoke also of how this training from the RSC filled a gap in their own teacher training. So they really talked about the urgent need for more inclusive pedagogical approaches for their teaching toolkits. In other words, approaches suitable for students that might have special educational needs and disabilities, or may have English as an additional language. And they could also see the potential for cross-curricular applications of these techniques. And we've seen that over many years that, of course, these techniques work with Shakespeare, and that's what we were testing, that combination. But, we've seen teachers use these techniques with all sorts of literature, but also with history, with religious education, with all sorts of aspects of the curriculum. And really importantly for us, I think, teachers spoke powerfully about the effect of this project on their own professional identity. They themselves, some of them, were initially intimidated by Shakespeare, and some of them, quite rightly, questioned the suitability of Shakespeare for primary settings for such young children. But the training and I think the teaching experience that followed was really transformative for many teachers. As we saw in the video that Matt showed earlier, some remembered why they'd entered the profession in the first place. Others cited the very close connection with students that this work enabled. And we know from our wider network of teachers who partner with the RSC that many have remained in school precisely because of their collaboration with the company and their investment in this way of teaching. And that's not to brag, but it's just to say that teachers take this work and they very much take ownership of it and they adapt it for their particular purposes. And that's really wonderful for us to see.
So the third measure was the myself as a learner scale. So Lynsey just mentioned confidence as one of the anecdotal observations that the teachers within the RCT mentioned, and it's something that we hear from teachers extensively. And confidence, it might be unsurprising in a kind of arts intervention with regards to confidence with speaking, for example. But the interesting thing for us was teachers were reporting confidence across the curriculum in terms of their attitudes to learning. So we wanted some way to think about how might we capture that quantitatively. And what we landed on was the myself as a learner scale. So this is a validated tool for academic self-concept that's been used extensively in social science research since the kind of mid-1990s. The way the measure works, pupils rate themselves on a 5-point Likert scale against 20 statements about their attitudes to learning. So it might be, I enjoy problem solving, and they rate themselves as to how true that is of themselves on that 5-point scale. In terms of the submissions that we had through the RCT, we had just under 1,000 submissions, both at pre-test and post-test. And what we saw were increases in the intervention group between pre and post-testing. So there were changes through the course of the intervention, before and after, and then also intervention outperforming the control at post-test. So the intervention itself was making a difference compared to that baseline data from the control group. The greatest difference within the intervention group was seen with regards to factors relating to agency and feelings towards ability. If I just show you some of the items. So these are some of the items that exist on that questionnaire. And these are some of the differences that we saw. So that first column is showing through the course of the intervention, so over time, between pre and post-test, the improvements in scores. And then the second column is looking at the end of the intervention between the two groups, between the control baseline and the intervention group that received the training. The item on the scale that relates to confidence with language scores highly, as you can see, as do those that relate to how pupils deal with difficult work. And our working hypothesis there is based on these sort of quantitative results and some of the qualitative evidence, is that in encountering Shakespeare, and particularly Shakespeare's difficult language, pupils are better equipped when encountering challenging schoolwork more broadly. So that's our kind of working hypothesis and something that we want to research further.
In addition to the RCT was a major part of this project, but perhaps more enjoyable, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, was our teacher researcher network. So we convened a teacher researcher network as part of Time to Act. We worked with 14 teachers across the RSC's Associate Schools programme. So that's our long-term partnership programme with schools. As I mentioned earlier, these were teachers very experienced in using these approaches, and we worked with them to co-create small school-based action research projects, very much dictated by the teachers' own interests. And they range, they were very diverse. Matt looked after 7, I looked after 7, and they range from projects such as, we had a Why Shakespeare project, so really thinking about, okay, if we accept that these drama-based pedagogies are quite effective in impacting on literacy, is Shakespeare necessary? Is Shakespeare really integral to that? Or could you replace Shakespeare with another playwright or another author, another topic? Would that work as well? So that was a really interesting project in terms of language use. But we also had projects relating to, for example, RSC in male pupils, certainly in the UK. In primary and secondary settings, boys don't do as well as girls in many of these environments. So a real interest in whether a more kind of kinetic, physical, embodied teaching approach helps lads in the classroom. And we also looked at language from the perspective of students who had English as an additional language, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and well-being. We were very interested in social and emotional development, or I should say our teachers are very interested in that as an impact of this way of working. So thanks, Matt. Next slide. We're going to whistle stop through some of our teacher researcher work. So what became apparent as we started working with these teachers? Two main thematic areas kept coming through. One was very much in line with the RCT, and that was language development in pupils, and Matt's going to talk a little bit more about that. But another area was very much related to well-being and social and emotional development. And this is something, again, that we'd love to do more work on in the future. So I worked with 3 teachers who had a particular focus in this area. 2 of those were in what we call in the UK special schools, so schools dedicated to students with special educational needs and disabilities. And those teachers have been part of our long-term partnership programme with schools for many years. We have our own SEN network that we work with those teachers. And it's certainly our hope that this way of teaching, because of its strongly sensory aspect, is very beneficial for some of those students. And I also worked in one school on a project with pupils who had multiple adverse childhood experiences, so multiple ACEs, as we describe it in the UK. I'm not sure if you describe it similarly in Australia, but children who have perhaps experienced a bereavement or a divorce, and how they might respond to this way of working. And we did see, we saw significant increases in well-being and engagement in classroom activities from these students. And some of them, as you can see on the slide, had profound and multiple learning disabilities. So we worked with children who were non-speaking, non-ambulant, and it was really interesting to see how the teacher adapts this work for those pupils. Very, very inspiring. We also worked with students, refugee students actually, in a further education setting, so post-compulsory education, learning English, and that was really interesting to see the increases in their confidence, from a reluctance to study Shakespeare, maybe even a dislike of getting up on your feet and acting things out, that kind of confusion and reservation, transformed to great enthusiasm, participation in group work. The pride that pupils take from overcoming their nerves, from often performing in front of their friends and their families is really wonderful to see. And yeah, as we say here, we're interested in those. Attendance in the UK, school attendance is a real issue, particularly in a post-COVID environment. You know, school refusal is a real problem, and we're interested in how this impacts on attendance. And certainly, we've seen that improves on days where Shakespeare is being studied, and we can see that there's much more extracurricular engagement with Shakespeare that wasn't there previously. And you know, parents reporting that their children had much greater enthusiasm for new experiences, not just this one, but other new experiences that it might have shied away from previously.
The other kind of major theme that ran through the Teacher Research Network really, sort of has resonance with the RCT with regards to language development. And a number of teacher researchers used the tools that we used in the RCT and also adopted research design. So they replicated that pre-post design where they would do pre-tests followed by an intervention, followed by post-tests of writing outputs. And even some intervention and control environments as well. These were much smaller samples, but what the teacher researcher, because of the action research nature of these projects and because of the experience of those teachers who are leading them, we were able to look with greater depth with regards to those kind of writing outputs. So we did a lot more analysis around kind of what we call aboutness in linguistics, so thinking about differences between genre and also that sensitivity to stylistic devices, so thinking very much about audiences, making meaningful choices about how that's constructed so that it resonates for particular purposes, writing with purpose and writing for audiences, which are core parts of the UK national curriculum within primary schools in particular. And also what those kind of smaller studies gave us the ability to do, which is incredibly difficult at scale, is look at the spoken word as well. So thinking about RSC, which is something that is moving up the agenda in terms of education priorities in the UK. Those smaller projects allowed us to do a lot more kind of observational work and also construct a number of frameworks. So I talked about the arts being a kind of crucible for developing new research measures. And one of the things that we've done in a few of these projects is think about what are the observational frameworks that might be appropriate to capturing how pupils engage, interact and speak in the classroom. You can see some of the indicators that we've identified in our kind of inventory of indicators of sort of RSC in terms of projection, tonal variation, even relating to body language, so thinking about posture and eye contact, as well as understanding the pragmatics around turn taking, and also the kind of fluency as well with regards to pausing and pronunciation and interjections. I'm just going to talk about one project. One of the beauties of research really is the kind of unintended consequences and research kind of raising more questions than it answers sometimes. And this is one of the projects from the Teacher Researcher Network that was undertaken by a teacher called Jade, and she works in 2 schools in Northampton, which is in the East Midlands. And she took 2 Year 3 classes, so Year 3 is ages 7 to 8, and they enacted the scene at the ball in Romeo and Juliet, so where Romeo first sees Juliet, and they produced 2 written pieces, a character description of Juliet at the ball, and a persuasive letter in which they argue as either Romeo or Juliet. They argue to their parents as to why they should be allowed to marry a Montague or why they should be allowed to marry a Capulet. So a piece of descriptive writing and a piece of persuasive writing. And what you see here on the screen, on the left is writing from a pupil who was being screened for dyslexia. Now, owing to spelling errors and because the handwriting isn't joined up, this pupil will be assessed as below expectations. So within primary curricula, teachers have to assess each pupil as either below expectations, working towards expectations, or above expectations. There are 2 features of this because of the spelling errors and simply because of the orthographics of the handwriting not being joined up. This pupil was below expectations. However, when we fed this into our linguistic software, the software that we used for the RCT, according to the indicators of sophistication that has, this piece was one of the highest scoring. Now, I think we were a little bit cautious, and particularly kind of within the organisation, a little bit cautious about thinking about text in quantitative ways. But one of the sort of beauties of this was being able to demonstrate an alternative means of evaluation to those kind of formal assessment criteria. And it raises some really interesting questions around what is it that we're valuing in terms of those evaluation criteria and in terms of good writing. Just to put a bit of meat on the bones and sort of just to show you what we mean by that. What we see here, just a couple of quotations really, showing both not only the kind of linguistic skill and sophistication, but also an imaginative and creative flair. So these comments say, this dress looks like it's made out of cloud. When she dances, it's like the stars are taking her to heaven. At parties, the more he dances with grace, the brighter the stars shine. Incredibly creative, really interesting sort of metaphors, using very sort of disparate images drawn from sort of different semantic fields, very sort of, almost kind of metaphysical in some respects. And the thing for us is we think this really raises really important methodological questions about how we assess children's writing. And at the same time, it's given us insight as to how these indicators are also kind of influenced by genre and type of writing exercise, and as well by Shakespeare and according to pupil ability.
Okay, so we're starting our wrap up, thinking about what we've learned from this project, and we've learned an awful lot, and I can't really explain everything here. We're still learning really, but just to pick out a few important things. First of all, in terms of our brief, what we were brought into the RSC to do, we think that we've evidenced that RSC teaching approaches impact upon social and emotional development and pupil literacy and attainment. And in fact, what we'd like to explore further is that relationship between pupil well-being and academic performance, if they can or should be disassociated, and the ways in which this way of teaching targets both simultaneously. As Matt has described just now in terms of Jade's work, we've definitely learnt that not all assessment measures meet the needs of a diverse pupil population. So I think we do need to ask questions about how young people's abilities are understood and assessed, and give teachers different ways of understanding potential in students. Methods of assessing reading, writing, and oracy used in education, not all, but some are based on research conducted many years ago. And while the literacy research underpinning these tests remains valid, we need to consider the ways in which they can disadvantage students, whether it's a young person who may be neurodivergent, struggling to spell, but writing with great flair and imagination, as we've just seen, or a pupil from a lower socioeconomic household who doesn't recognise middle-class conventions in language use. Arts learning measures can help us develop a better range of tools through which children can demonstrate their potential. And finally, working closely with educators and practitioners helps ensure the suitability of school assessment tools and impacts also on professional, teacher professional identity. All of our research has been co-created with teachers and for teachers, not just the Teacher Researcher Network, the randomized control trial. We collaborated with our expert group made up of many teachers to design that project. So just little bit of showing off before we finish. So just thinking about the legacy of this project in some ways. So we did share the front cover of the Times back when, this was in February last year, shared the cover of the Times with the King, no less, and our former Prime Minister. So that was really pleasing. That was when we first announced the results from the project. And we also won the Excellence in Arts Education Award at the UK Theatre Awards. So that was a very glitzy night for Matt and I, and slightly out of our comfort zone, but it was really pleasing to see that work validated in that way.
And that recognition as well, kind of in the sector press, if you like. So we know this is Lynn Gardner, who's one of the sort of preeminent theatre critics in the UK, who listed it as one of her 10 reasons to be cheerful, the Times Up research. we already know that there are other performing arts organisations now who are interested in becoming independent research organisations, so they're on the track to do that, and recognising the value of making that case for support for the arts, both in terms of funders, but also in terms of education policy, and also starting to sort of see those citations in publications, both academic publications, but also sort of more mainstream, still academic publications, but more mainstream press that we get as well. One final sort of outcome of this project has been our next project, which we are just in the throes of. We're just coming to the end of a recruitment phase for a new project, which essentially scales up the RCT. So this is with an organisation called the Education Endowment Foundation, and they were really curious with the Time to Act project and research, and they had a call for applications for projects that research the impacts on particular interventions regarding pupil writing, and particularly around the motivation to write, with a specific focus on areas of structural disadvantage. So we were successful in applying for this project, which is now kind of 3 months in, and it's constructed as an RCT, what they call an efficacy trial. So that's essentially looking at does the intervention works, their efficacy trial. It's the sort of second biggest of the trials that they conduct. As an organisation, they're really interested in what works in education settings, and they have networks of sort of hundreds of schools that involve themselves in this research. We're being funded by the Department for Education Accelerator Fund, which is particularly geared towards what we call these areas of structural disadvantage across the country, or education investment areas, where we feel like essentially the pupil population is underserved with regards to the education opportunities they can encounter. And in doing that, it's been a really interesting process in terms of thinking deeply and thoroughly about the process of change. So we've developed a whole theory of change around our rehearsal room practice, and doing that in consort with other experts. So we're working with external evaluators called NFER, which is the National Foundation for Education Research, who are really the experts in, particularly with regards to language interventions. And they've been able to come to us with a suite of new measures to be able to really interrogate the validity of this as an intervention. And they're working in conjunction with the University of Exeter and linguistic experts there, as well as EEF itself. So we are now coming to the end of our recruitment phase, and we're looking for 200 schools. So it will be around 5,500 pupils that will be involved in this trial. And essentially that will run over this next academic year, whereby 100 Year 5 teachers will come to Stratford and be trained in our rehearsal rooms in these techniques. And similarly, they will deliver 20 hours from November onwards throughout the academic year, with a series of kind of writing exercises that draw on some of the measures that we had with regards to those linguistic measures, but also some more qualitative sort of marking, more traditional sort of curriculum marking that goes alongside that, as well as a lot of qualitative research and sort of interviews and focus groups with teachers themselves to think about the kind of actual implementation and execution of this within the classroom. So we're really excited about that. We're almost at our target of those 200 settings. So we've had a really positive response from teachers in terms of embarking on this, both as a research project, but also in terms of thinking in terms of pupil opportunities to accessing high quality arts interventions, and also teachers' own professional development. So we're really excited to get cracking on that in the next couple of weeks with regards to the launch of the actual project with parents and pupils themselves. And that brings our presentation to a conclusion. So thank you for letting us speak, and we welcome any comments or questions.
Thanks so much, Lynsey and Matt. That was quite the tour, and an extraordinary amount of work as well that's gone on to get you to where you are. I mean, having been involved in research for a little while, I just can see the hours and hours of work that's gone into getting, all the boring stuff done to make the really kind of exciting stuff possible. So congratulations and well done on such a wonderful piece of work. The thing that struck me immediately is the resonances with the school drama work that has been done with Sydney Theatre Company here, Robin Ewing's work, Professor Robin Ewing's work, that shows a really strong relationship between drama and literacy. In fact, there's a plethora of work out there now that is showing this, and yet it's very hard to talk policymakers into taking it seriously. So I'm starting to wonder whether we need a big comparative or a big study that brings these threads together to make the argument more international potentially. But anyway, that's just a wondering of mine. There's some actual questions rather than inane academic wonderings. Anna's asked, obviously, or Anna can ask this herself if she wants to. Anna, do you want to ask that yourself?
Sure. I just look. Thank you so much for the density of that material. There's just so much to return to. I'm going to spend a lot of happy time with the video, but what I think you didn't have time for in profiling your research was giving us a bit of a flavour of what actually happens in those classrooms. Could you briefly give us a sense of whether, like, do you really, is it a version of scene work, or are there other varieties of textual application that happen?
Yeah, there's a kind of suite of approaches. That the basic principle goes back to the idea that the ways in which directors work with actors in the rehearsal room can be transplanted and used by teachers and their pupils in the classroom. So to take an example, in terms of, it's probably easier to talk about some of the examples. So an actor, and thinking about kind of particularly with language development and literacy, we see when an actor engages with text, they're thinking about character, they're making interpretive choices, they're comprehending, they're doing creative exercises off the back of kind of these textual prompts and inputs. So lots of overlap with kind of literacy curricula in that sense. So that's the kind of some of the principles and the methods. But the exercises might be as simple as starting by building an ensemble through doing some choral reading, so that you're kind of getting to grips with the kind of sound of the language, and then you might extract vocabulary from the language and create what's called a word carpet. And there's one exercise where students will be guided through the streets of Verona, for example. One student will be blindfolded and will kind of lead them through, and they will kind of navigate their way through this kind of textual architecture, if you like. And you might have other pupils kind of whispering sort of words as they sort of pass through that, create this kind of soundscape. So we do use lots of kind of soundscape props. We do various exercises around the kind of scene setting. So what tends to happen is there will be a kind of introductory kind of ensemble building and introduction to the world of the play. So with Macbeth, it might be creating a scene on the heath. It might be the introduction of the Three Witches, and then gradually, particularly with primary schools, there's a kind of gradual introduction of elements of the text.
So you use the text.
Yes, and that's something we're very particular about, is using Shakespeare's original language and those constructions. And it might be that we start from kind of individual pieces of vocabulary that create the world, and then move on to sort of longer stretches of text. I'm trying to think of other examples, Lynsey, in terms of.
Well, do they appear in the Winston books?
Yeah, so
yeah.
Okay,
sorry, Matt. No, they do to some extent. We also have a toolkit, don't we? We have teachers' toolkits for both primary and secondary, so in different age groups, that really do outline all the different exercises. And also what we find, as we've alluded to in the presentation, is that teachers come up with their own, variations of these. So we really need a toolkit to gather all that incredible collateral from the teachers who've used these ways of thinking. But yeah, I think Matt did a great job, and I wasn't concentrating because I was sending Fiona the link to our report in the chat.
Just a very brief example is the Tempest exercise that we showed you as part of the RCT. So the active approach that the intervention groups did as part of that were they were sailors on the ship in the shipwreck, and there are various instructions that they're given whereby they move to stage right, stage left, upstage, downstage, based on these individual lines from the play. And so they play the role of those, and the teacher will call them out, and they have to move and actively, and then they're also kind of given phrases themselves to shout out that are lines of text from that opening scene of The Tempest. So they are kind of experiencing the storm, and you might get some pupils providing the noises of the ship and the noises of the storm, and pupils might then break into groups and improvise based on that and sort of develop scenes off the back of that. Or even I went into one class where they did a sort of prologue to that, so they used that as an active exercise, and then they thought about the kidnapping of Miranda and Prospero back in the day, as it were. One of the kind of clearest example that I tend to give with the recruitment for this new trial is thinking about kind of classroom skills and sort of actor skills. One of the most sort of popular exercises is thinking about a piece of text, and an actor has to decide, what do we know, what do we interpret, and what do we predict? So they're always in this state of thinking about, within that world of the play, what is going to, how do I situate myself in that? And those questions have to be answered. And they're really effective tools in a classroom for thinking about, in terms of comprehension, in terms of inference, and then in terms of kind of creative development, if you like, as well. So you can see direct parallels in terms of some of those skills that are required in terms of their formal writing, whether it's an essay or whether it's with regards to creative writing as well. So that's just sort of a couple of examples.
Thank you.
There, got a question here about emotional literacy from, sorry, I've just lost it, from Ashley. She says, during your talk, you mentioned emotional literacy, which I found intriguing. Could you please elaborate a bit more on what you meant by emotional literacy in your context and how it was addressed or developed in your research?
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Ashley. I can start with this one. It was actually almost accidental, our interest in this area, because we were interested in the kind of well-being affordances of this work. We were certainly interested in social and emotional development, but it wasn't central to the randomized control trial. But when we saw the writing samples from the randomized control trial, and as I said, when we saw, the much more emotional language being used by children exposed to this work, it really got us thinking about the way in which this work, its embodied aspects, its focus on character and perspective taking, how that enabled children to think about both the character's emotions, but also apply that to their own emotions and the ways in which they express those emotions. And that's what I'm thinking about when I say emotional literacy. But we also had, if Matt doesn't mind, I'll pass on to him, because we also had a teacher researcher network project that looked at this in a bit more detail, didn't we?
Yeah, so there's a teacher in a primary school in Blackpool in the northwest of England who was interested in emotional literacy, and particularly around, there's a body of research that talks about dyslexia and emotional literacy, it talks very eloquently about those that have dyslexia being more emotionally literate, and it was a kind of principle that she was intrigued by and wanted to test. So she created her own intervention and control group, which were essentially those pupils that were either diagnosed or being screened for dyslexia, and other pupils as her kind of comparison set. And what she did was both the kind of writing output, so they were doing Taming of the Shrew. And the interesting thing with Taming of the Shrew is the kind of the stakes that raises in terms of parental, and she was interested in parental relationships specifically. And she used that as a prism by which to develop a suite of writing exercises, which we ran through our semantic software and looked at the kind of emotional profile, which, yes, those pupils, dyslexic pupils, interestingly, were using far more, and even more so than our randomized control intervention and control groups, far more emotional language, emotional vocabulary. But what she also used were a series, so I think there were 3 validated tools, and I can't for the life of me remember off the top of my head what they're called, but they are standardized tools that are used in UK education contexts that are similarly kind of questionnaire Likert scales, And she administered those at 3 testing points throughout, so kind of pre, mid, and post intervention. And what we saw was a kind of validation of our kind of semantic analysis, in the sense that those emotional literacy scales, pupils were scoring higher on those as well, and there's a great sort of correlation between those two. So we had that kind of quantitative evidence, both in terms of their own kind of expression, if you like, in that writing and thought experiment, those exercises, but also with regards to these validated emotional literacy questionnaires and tools.
It was the Boxall profile, I think, Matt. Was it
Boxall. That was the one. Yeah.
I just looked
So
it
that
up.
was one of
Looked it up.
Yeah.
One of them. Yeah. Michael, can I come back to your inane ramblings that you described, self-described? Just because actually this is a really live issue for us, and we're actually working with, in the UK, but there's an organisation called the Cultural Learning Alliance, and they do a lot of advocacy work for arts education in the country, and we're working with them to create some rapid evidence reviews for the value of different arts education. So we've done one in dance education, music education. We're currently writing the review for drama education. So we will certainly use the work that you've shared with us. But I think you're absolutely right in terms of internationalizing that conversation. When we first launched the findings for this project, we did it in Westminster with quite a few policymakers and government representatives in the room. But it is very difficult to influence policy. And often, because of the nature of government, they're looking for fixes to situations that emerge. But we have had really fruitful conversations here with the Department for Education and the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And we're really trying to influence that in the UK. But it is an international issue, and it's heartening in some ways to hear that it's the same. It's the same for you in terms of the struggle as it is for us.
Yeah, I mean, fascinated by those rapid reviews. We've got quite a lot of evidence coming out of Australia, and some rapid reviews that you may not have seen, that we'd be happy to share with you as well. Some that's come out of us and some that's come out of the ANU. So there's a bit of evidence around. So I think actually there is a need to kind of network our understanding in this area, because we're so small, but sometimes we don't even know each other exists. And while I think there's a novelty, certainly a novelty in the way RSC's done RCTs, just to use alphabet soup here for a second, there is quite a lot of other evidence around about motivation engagement in the arts that's come out of Australia and different places that has actually had an impact on policy. So there's a policy story to be told there potentially, but this isn't my webinar. The question I've got for you actually is, and I don't think, it's not clear to me that your research has looked into this, but what effects do you think Shakespeare methodology has, and what effects do you think, and I might be asking for a kind of a best guess here potentially, and what effects do you think drama has as a form? So what's about the Shakespeare, what's about the drama, or is it indivisible?
I mean, yeah, we couldn't prize those apart in Time to Act. We were looking at the combination. We really want to prize them apart. I mean, we do have some, quite a lot of our research findings seem to point towards the drama rather than the Shakespeare in some ways. But there are, the complexity of the language. And especially in this sort of, this settings with young children, it's not intuitive to think that they would be responsive to that level of complexity and adult themes and content. Frankly, a lot of children's literature is designed for children, and that's not what Shakespeare is. So we think that's really interesting from from both a language perspective in terms of grappling with that complexity and then, maybe incorporating it into your own writing, but also, in terms of the maturity of some of the themes. There are certain texts that seem more appropriate for younger children, and they're certainly the texts that we work with them. So, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, The Tempest. But these are still not designed for children, and I think they respond to that. And we've seen that in some of our smaller projects. But, there are also theories around gappiness in Shakespeare, that it gives you the space to kind of insert yourself within the text, to bring your lived experience into it in a way that not all literature does. And I have my own pet theory about when children speak that language out loud, it gives them importance. And for some of the children that we work with, that's really, empowering. But Matt will have other things to say about this.
I mean, I was just going to mention the one teacher researcher project that was called Why Shakespeare. And in that project, the teacher took 2 play texts, one of which was Burley Doherty. It was an adaptation of a novel she wrote called Street Child, which is about the workhouse in the Victorian era play. And she did pre-writing and post, doing these active approaches to teach that text. And then she did it with Macbeth as well. So she was stripping out, she was thinking, is there a difference when I use these approaches with Shakespeare versus when I just use these approaches with another text? And we did a similar kind of analysis of written outcomes. And yes, there was a difference. There was a bump both between sort of before and after from the kind of approaches. But when you do it with Shakespeare, you're maximizing those kind of linguistic flair, sophistication. In talking with her about that, she said the interesting thing in the classroom is that the questions that pupils ask and the level of engagement is different. So whereas with Street Child, they would ask about the peculiarities of sort of legislation or the Workhouse Act, or specifics about the context with regards to being a child working in a factory. When it came to Macbeth, they were talking about revenge and violence and power, and the much more kind of expansive and abstract types of concepts. Now that's a very small study. That's only one text, and it's by no means kind of what we might consider sort of canonical or classical literature. So it might feel sort of, there might be sort of other comparisons to be made with sort of other texts, but it's a really interesting provocation. And then the other thing as well is thinking about Shakespeare, particularly in primary context, as a leveler. So it's very unlikely that pupils arriving at primary school will have prior knowledge of Shakespeare. So there is something, particularly in a UK context, that when you do Shakespeare at primary level, it is something that everyone can come to from the starting blocks, if you like. And this idea of cultural capital, Lynsey, that you alluded to, in terms of irrespective of whether we consider Shakespeare the greatest writer of all time or not, he does have a certain reputation. And so for a young person to do Shakespeare and sort of engage in that kind of high culture, if you like, that level of complexity, there is an interesting sort of piece of research to be done as to what that does with regards to confidence, what it does with regards to them feeling kind of culturally engaged, part of the fabric, and also that stretch that Shakespeare has in terms of the complexity. If I can get Shakespeare, I can get anything, which is some of the stuff we sort of maybe see in our academic self-concept measures. So yeah, lots of hypothesizing off the back of this. But...
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an unfair question, really, to ask you to nail that down. But I just think that this whole area and this whole kind of corpus of research, and it's more than one piece of research. Obviously, you're drawing on lots of research here. Has just been an opportunity for several of us to nerd out on the opportunities and the possibilities that you've opened up. And so, I could talk about this for hours. I don't think you'd thank me for doing that, but it's just been such a fantastic insight into what's possible, I think, for a theatre company. And some of the insights you've gained into the process, I think, would be incredibly useful in thinking about what an international kind of proper, large-scale piece of work on drama / Shakespeare / literacy might look like. And thank you for inspiring us and kind of starting what I hope is an ongoing conversation about this work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk about this again.
But thank you so much for your time this morning / this evening, and hopefully see you again soon.
Thank you. Thanks to our audience as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.